You're listening to The Virgin Sex Educator, a podcast devoted to tackling the taboo and finding the connection between spirituality and sexuality. To submit your anonymous questions, click the link in my Instagram bio. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my LDS parenting series that I am doing in partnership with sexedrescue.com. If this is your first time listening to me, hi, welcome. I'm Nikki. I am an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I am a sexologist. I have a master's degree in sexology, and I specialize in sexual dysfunction and products. And for this particular series, I am helping my LDS crowd, my people, my community, specifically the LDS parents, in helping them navigate how to teach children about sexuality. And I did recently a poll on my Instagram and my Facebook asking what topics parents wanted me to cover because, you know, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we got a lot of parents. And although I primarily work with adults, the next question after we solve whatever issues they may be having and we get them to a really healthy place in their own sexuality, the very next thing that they ask me is, okay, great, how do I help my child to not end up where we did? And how do I help them have a healthy relationship with their sexuality? So this podcast continues to be a very fun project for me of taking all of these ideas and values and ways of teaching adults and now filtering them into a way to teach parents. So today we are going to be answering the question of when and how do I teach my child about sex, like at what ages? Because when I put out that poll on Instagram, I got a ton of people that messaged me, and there were some common themes and some similarities between the requests. And one of the top ones was basically a step-by-step guide of how to talk to my kid about sex. Now, I do highly recommend going on sexedrescue.com because Kath Hakinson, who is the mastermind behind the website, she has created those sources for you. She has really great information on there, blog posts, as well as guides, recommendations of children's books to read, which I will also include as well in her section, LDS parenting and just like faith in sex ed. I have my resource page that is recommendations from me, as well as what Kath has researched as well. So just a plethora of resources on there. So please just know what I'm going to say is not exhaustive in any way. Anything that I say on this podcast is hopefully just a launching off point for all of you. Just like a base, just the start to the conversation, and then I can really just direct you towards other resources and people who specialize in parents, specifically like teaching children about sex and sexuality, because that is not necessarily my specialty area. Where I specialize is in adults who never had these conversations and where that leads. So I see the end result, and I help people with sexual dysfunction and helping them come to a more normalized place of embracing their sexuality, especially as an LDS member or just religious in general. I work with a lot of different denominations beyond just LDS, but being LDS myself, I understand a lot of the cultural nuances. But anyways, I work with adults, so I'm able to see where these narratives lead, and they're primarily negative. So I highly recommend going to check out Kath's resources available and listening to this podcast as a way to change that so that your children do not end up in my office one day, or at least not for sexual dysfunction. I'd much rather having people come into my office who are really excited to have a conversation about sexuality because they love it and it's something joyful in their life and they want to expand upon that. Those are really fun conversations for me. But unfortunately, that is not usually the type of conversations that I have, which I am just so honored that I get to be in this space and exist and to bring a lot of help to people that need it. But I love the idea of parents teaching their kids from a very young age that we can have healthy relationships with our sexuality so that we can avoid what I see in my office every day. So with that, let's get started. A lot of parents come to the conversation about sex and sexuality with a lot of apprehension because they don't actually know what is normal, what's too much, what's too soon, like what are you even supposed to say? So the question really is like, where do I start and when do we start? And the honest answer is, it depends. There isn't, like one perfect age because each child is different. So, you as the parent really need to see what developmental level your child is at and what would be appropriate. But what we do know from research, which gives us a lot of insight on when we can start thinking about having these conversations and if our children are ready for that, is we know that kids start to get curious about where babies come from when they're about 4 to 5 years old. So sometimes that happens a little bit earlier, sometimes it's slightly later, but every child is different, but that's around the age that the particular question of where babies come from is going to start. So instead of thinking about all of this as like one big conversation that you have to, get right, it does help to remember that this is a continuous conversation that's going to unfold over the course of your child's life. So it's not just the talk. Instead, we want to be thinking about it as a series of several conversations, like just having it as an open topic all the time in your home, that this is something that can always be entered into and like move in and out of over the course of their entire life. And really, of course, with you, when they're living with you, their childhood and into their adolescence. So, kids are going to forget a lot of what you say anyways. So that actually takes a lot of the pressure off, or hopefully it should. You're not trying to, say everything perfectly. That's not our goal here. We're just going to be trying to build their understanding just like you do with any other topic. Starting with these, 3 to 5 year olds, the most common question that they ask, their first question, is not about sex. It's usually where babies come from. And we need to remember that those are two very different things that they're asking about. In the same way that we combine a lot of other topics, pornography and masturbation, as I've talked about before, those are separate things. Those are different. And in the same way that we as adults, we're adding this sexual meaning to things, we need to remember that children don't just implicitly have that. That's just not in their thoughts, in their vocabulary, in their world. Things start off as not sexual. So we need to be careful not to add our own apprehension of this means something sexual because you have learned that meaning over time. They have not yet learned that meaning. So when a child is asking you where a baby comes from, they typically are just trying to understand where they were before they were here. Where did they come from? So the answer to that is way easier. That's very simple. Now, for people who are LDS, this is where we can say, that we existed before we came here to earth. We were in heaven before we got a body, and then we grew inside of a uterus, which is a special place inside of our body that a baby's can grow. And then here's the important part. Then you stop. You pause. You wait. You don't, rush ahead and over-explain. That is a very common thing because, you're ready. You're prepped for this conversation. You're like, I want my child to know they can come to me. And that is awesome. That is great. That's what we want. But just answer what they asked. Because, again, they are not taking it 10 steps ahead because they don't even know to do that. So you just answer it in the most basic way is, if they're asking where a baby comes from, a baby grows inside a uterus, which is a place inside your body that babies can grow. Then what tends to happen is either they say okay, and then they just move on because you answered it, or they will then ask another question. Well, how does the baby get there? How does it get in the uterus? Now, again, with this, you're just going to take it step by step. Answer the question that they're asking. So for that, you can say something like, it takes 2 parts to make a baby. 1 part comes from a man and 1 part comes from a woman. When those parts come together, then they can start to grow a baby. If you happen to be in the kitchen making something, you can easily demonstrate this and show, I put these 2 ingredients together and it starts to make something, right? Something that they're able to tangibly see or connect with, even at this very young age. Then, after you give your very short, succinct explanation, you're going to pause again. And sometimes that's going to be enough. They're not going to need any more. That you answered their question. And if it's not, if they do want more, then they'll keep going. So you want to follow them. You want them to take the lead and not for you to get ahead of them. Instead, really see where they're wanting to take you. What is their question? And then where are they going with their follow-ups? So eventually, most kids will start to ask something like, well, how do those 2 parts get together? Now, this is the part where a lot of parents brace themselves because they're like, oh, here we go. Here we are. We're we're at sex. But it doesn't have to be that apprehensive. It can just be really simple. Again, we're going simple here. Your child is not going to be able to understand some complex idea. So you might be able to say something like, one way that can happen is through sex. That's where a man puts his penis into a woman's vagina and sperm travels to meet the egg. Again, stopping, making sure that you're not delivering, too much information. You're just answering that question. Now, they might be like, well, that's weird, or that's gross. And that's normal to have that type of reaction. Because at this age, at 5 years old, they're not thinking about sex in some emotional way. They don't even know what it is. To them, it's just this strange thing that adults do. And now they're learning that weird, strange thing is what makes a baby. That's how we get 2 parts together to grow in the uterus, which is a special part in the body. All right. Now, as children, get older, usually around 7 to 10 years of age, somewhere in that range, studies show that the conversations, they don't just automatically become more intense, but they do become more layered. They become more nuanced because your child can then start understanding more. So at this stage in life, a 7 to 10-year-old, you may have your child come home and they could say something like, why would someone want to have sex if they aren't having a baby? Because if they've only, heard about it in relation of this is what allows for a baby to be made, this is now when we can start to enter into understanding that sex is pleasurable, that it isn't just for one thing. An easy way to have that type of conversation is to say something like, hey, that's a really great question. Sometimes adults choose to have sex because it's a way that they can feel close to each other, connected, and it doesn't have to just be for a baby. It's this adult activity that you're able to do to grow a healthier, deeper, emotional, intimate relationship. Wow, that was a lot of adjectives that I just used. Maybe you use slightly less. When they're at this 7 to 10-year-old stage, you can start asking them questions of, what have you heard about this? So that way you can more easily understand where they're coming from. And again, that way you're not rushing to fill in everything. They may not need that. That's may not be what they're actually going for in asking you. It could truly just be just that one question. And then once you answer it, okay, I got my answer. For some kids, obviously, they are more curious, and then you just follow them where they want to go. But we don't want to be jumping ahead. That's the key, is we do not want to be taking it to a place where they're not taking it. We do also know that around this age, 7 to 10, is the time in life when kids start to understand and notice more about their bodies in a social capacity. So they might ask why, boys and girls' bodies are different, or why certain parts are private, and why we wear certain clothing. Why do we wear underwear? And why does my brother wear boxers? And why does my sister wear this? It depends on the developmental stage that they're at, but this is where these questions are going to start coming up, especially if a young girl starts having her period around 9-10 years old. You really want to make sure that you're having these types of conversations prior with menstruation and body confidence in young women, but it's equally important to make sure that your little boys are understanding this as well, that these are changes that are going on in sometimes their peers, sometimes their siblings. It depends. But they're going to naturally be more curious about it because that is the stage in which they're entering into, and this is what is occurring in their world at that time. To have that conversation about differences in, male and female anatomy, it can be something like, different bodies have different parts, and those different parts have different purposes. So some of those parts we want to keep private because that is something that is just for them until they are at an age in which they're old enough to decide to create something more with somebody else. And again, we can always tack on a safety conversation here about why those parts of our body are private, who can touch them, when, what is appropriate, how to talk about this with, your mom or dad, if someone else is touching these parts of you. That can all be encompassed in this conversation. We always want to make sure that we are adding that element to it. Again, don't jump too far ahead, but it can just be as casual as, oh yeah, this is like how this happens. We have this, we have these different parts, for your brother, it's his penis and his testicles, and for you, it's your vulva and your vagina and your clitoris. Again, depending on their age, how much you would want to go in depth, but making sure that you use the correct anatomical terminology because that greatly reduces their risk of sexual exploitation, and making sure it's known that both penis, testicles, and vulva are parts of our body that are not meant to be touched by others. I am going to have one of my episodes be specifically about this topic, like teaching sexual safety, but that's a different episode. So for this one, we're going to just move on and not go too in depth on the safety part. At 13 years of age, that's when most children are going through puberty. So a lot of body changes happening, and we want to make sure that we're talking about that and that it's normal and what to expect. This, of course, can include periods, also wet dreams, body hair, how that hair can help protect us, that it's healthy, that it's good. On the areola of the nipples, we want to make sure that girls know that the bumps that will be created around the opening of their nipple are normal, and we don't want to be treating those like acne. We don't want to be popping those. We don't want to be scratching them. That those are actually glands that secrete an oil, and they can help lubricate the nipple and the areola. So it protects the skin against infections, dryness, and this is especially important during breastfeeding. So this part of our body is being developed in puberty to help get our body ready for one day potentially being able to experience breastfeeding. So we want to make sure that we are taking care of that part of ourselves that's growing so that we can one day have its full function. This is also going to be a great time where you can start talking about erections and about ejaculation. Around 13 to 15 years old, this is when usually young boys start having what are called nocturnal erections. Now, they need to be having these. These are very healthy. Most men actually don't even realize how many erections they have in a typical night. So healthy men will experience about 3 to 6 of these erections lasting about 25 to 35 minutes when they are in REM sleep. And this really is a way for the body to make sure that the tissue inside the penis is staying healthy, and it helps prevent a curvature and a calcification of the tissue inside the penis, which is called Peyronie's disease, which 1 in 10 men suffer with. So again, a lot of men don't know that. So we want to make sure that we're teaching this to young boys, that this is normal and this is actually our body's way of staying healthy, and healthy heart health is going to lead to better erections, longer erections, that's an indication that something is going right in our body. So if you have a young boy who's extremely active as well, a very good runner, has great cardiovascular health, we can see an increase in those erections. And we want to make sure that they know that is to be expected. Sticking on this for just 1 second longer, because this is where I get really nerdy, is anything to do with the human body, like it has everything to do with sexual dysfunction, so I know a lot about it. When it comes to erections, especially for teenagers, it's helpful for them to know that there are 2 types of erections that they can get. There are spinal erections. These are reflexogenic. In the same way that you hit your knee, there's a certain point on your knee that you hit underneath and it will automatically spring your leg forward, or on your elbow, it'll automatically spring your arm out. There's a part of the spinal cord that can be triggered by tactile stimulation that then creates this reflex in your penis. So, for example, there's this joke that the scariest place for a teenage boy is on the way to school, because they're on a bus, and that bus going up and down, if you're, sitting on a bench in the bus that is quite bouncy, what that can do is that can trigger that reflex through your spinal cord that then sends blood flow into your penis and causes an erection. That's not coming from a place of you saw something and were then aroused. It is literally a reflex, in the same way that hitting your knee springs your leg forward and your arm springs your arm out. There is a place in your spinal cord that can be triggered that will then spring your penis outward. So again, letting them know that this is normal, that this is expected, that this can happen. So that way when it does, they're not thinking that there's something wrong with them, especially these young boys who, if we're being raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they may really associate I want to have, good, clean, pure thoughts, and that somehow having an erection is somehow the absence of pure thoughts. That's not true. And we also want to get really far away from that narrative as well. But that's a common one. That's a common narrative. And it can cause a lot of unnecessary shame, because this is a normal part of your body's functioning. And when you are in your puberty stage, that's going to be happening a lot more, and it's going to be happening constantly and frequently. And it can be very overwhelming. And if you have, this attached shame to a natural bodily function, that can be really detrimental to their mental and emotional health. For young girls, in the same way that boys have nocturnal erections, women can also have clitoral erections as well. We do get, it's the same tissue that makes the penis shaft, is what makes the bulbs of our clitoris, and those can very easily engorge with blood and cause what is called a female erection. This is, again, very natural, very normal, to be expected, because these parts of our bodies are being woken up at that stage in our development. They're, kicking into gear, and your body's checking to make sure everything's working and that it's growing and learning how to control these parts of yourself that have been dormant for a long time. So we need to make sure that we're normalizing that. Going back to the conversation of sex in particular, when we're talking about these bodily changes, we can also talk about how they can be very closely associated with feelings, with, this urge and desire to connect with other people. You may start looking at people differently. People in your class, you may start to have crushes on them. And that's when they can start to ask you things. Why do people kiss? Or, even something like, is it normal to think about this stuff? And what does it mean to have a crush? What is that? These are going to be the types of questions that they're going to start having at that stage, and let them lead. If you have done the work where you feel comfortable with this topic and you have created an environment in which your children know that they can come to you with this, that is really where you're just going to be able to sit back and let them come to you and start asking these questions. Or if you're teaching them, hey, I want you to know that this is totally normal. Your body might have this reaction when you're talking about erections, that there's different types of erections. There's erections that are that start via stimuli. Maybe you see something, you hear something, you think of something, and then that's going to create blood flow that goes down into your genitals and creates an erection, and that is called arousal. But there's this other way that it can also happen that has nothing to do with that it can just happen. It kind of just happens to you, and it's not because you thought of anything. So that's when they can start to have questions, is when you're just explaining normal, healthy bodily function, you're just letting them know, hey, you might experience this. Then they might add to that conversation and start asking questions of like, well, what if I do have a thought and, I have an erection? If I look at someone and I'm attracted to them and then this happens, that's when you can start to see where they're at and where their understanding is and what they're curious about. Is you just can control the body conversation. Hey, letting you know your body's going to be doing these things, going through these changes, and then they can add the emotional elements, the meaning to it, and you can see how much meaning they're adding. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Hopefully. I hope so. If you have this 13-year-old, to 15-year-old child coming to you saying, that I'm starting to have crush on this person, or I like this person, then you can really respond with, that's totally normal. That's great. Like, this is to be expected. Way to go. You're hitting milestones. And you can say things like, as your body changes and as it grows, you are going to start to notice people differently. And you're going to have this curiosity and this desire to connect with them more. But part of growing up is figuring out what kind of relationships you want and what makes you feel respected and safe, and how much capability you have to make someone else feel respected and safe. And I have a lot more examples of this on my other episodes where we talk about values, we talk about relationships and things like that. For this particular conversation, it might continue on and go into you explaining that, things like kissing or sex are usually part of a relationship when people are able to trust each other and really care about one another. And they're things that we need to make thoughtful choices about, and that takes time and maturity. Like, you're going to be able to better make those decisions as you get older. Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, who, if you know me, you know I love her. She has an entire section of her book talking to parents of how to teach your children. And something that she says is guidelines and guardrails set by parents protect children from more freedom than they can responsibly navigate. Make sure that those guidelines aren't placed to simply manage your own anxieties about their growing independence. Oh, so good. I especially love that she always talks about it in this framework of freedom, that it's not this big, terrible, bad thing, so you can't handle it yet, but instead it is this incredible, wonderful thing that you are going to have access to, but at this point in time, it is too much freedom for you to control. In the same way that if, a 13, 14, 15-year-old is just going out into the ocean, it may seem fun and amazing, but that can be very overwhelming. Those waves can overtake them. So instead, we're teaching them how to become strong swimmers, how to have a healthy relationship with respecting, in this analogy, respecting what the waves can do and the destruction that they can bring, but also the joy and the way that we can ride them and the way that you can interact with them and everything that the ocean has to offer. If you don't know how to swim, that freedom that this open space of water will give you will actually bring a lot more fear and can hurt you more than it can benefit you. So we want you to be able to access this freedom and feel confident in it and to have an enjoyable experience with your sexuality, with somebody else, with just your relationship with yourself, feeling good about who you are. That's what we, as your parents, are wanting for you. So we are helping you on that path because you don't have those skills yet. But that's why we're here. We're your parents, so we are here to help you and for you to really experience all that life has to offer. When kids start transitioning into their later teenage years, the conversations are going to transition as well. This is because now it's more than just like mere curiosity. It is now starting to become a part of their real life. It is now tangible. It is something that is being acted upon in some ways, from something as simple as like hand holding. But this is also the time in life when they are less likely to come to you with a direct question. So these types of conversations are usually going to start coming at you in a more indirect way. So knowing that as a parent can also be helpful in how you navigate these conversations. Whereas for children, if you've created this safe environment, they will come to you and they will ask you that question. Whereas with teenagers, it's a bit different. So this is where you can start to have these conversations. Maybe you're watching a show together and there's this relationship that's being shown that is clearly not healthy. And maybe they mention something about, what their friends are doing, or instead of shutting that down and like turning it into a lecture, you can use that moment and instead ask for their opinion. What do you think about that relationship? Do you think that they're treating each other well? Or, what would you do and what would you want in that situation? What do you think of your friends' relationships? What does it say to you? How do you think the other person feels? This is where you want to show that you value their own opinions, their own intellect, their individuality, that you see that they are their own person with their own thoughts, and that you trust that they can have mature thoughts about these different topics and about the topic of sex, sexuality, relationships, that these are not things that are just like passively going by them, but that you see that this is a part of their world and therefore they must be thinking about them in some capacity. And so you want to know what their thoughts are. This is a great time where you can start really asking for their opinions. And you're not just, explaining sex, but you're going to help them connect to the kind of life and relationships that they will want to build. Really teaching those values. Okay, we're coming to a close here. I think one thing I did forget to mention is the common question of like, okay, if there is a point to have, a sit down talk of this is how sex works, at what age do you do that? That's typically, for a typical child, is going to be about 8 to 9 years old. Usually before they hit puberty and they start having all these bodily changes, before a girl gets her period, is a great time for them to understand like the exact, this is how this works. So up until that point, you can explain it simply and then just kind of wait to see if their curiosity takes them further or not. You'll be able to tell whether your child is ready for this conversation or at what depth. And the great news is there are tons of resources. There are children's books that you can read with your child. You can also give the book to your child, have them go read it on your own, or on their own, sorry, and then they can come back to you, and that's when you'll have a discussion about it. Maybe you do it over the course of quite a few weeks, depending on the book that you have. Again, all these sources are all over the sexedrescue.com website. But yeah, you can take these books, these materials that have already been made. People have already put in the work, so you might as well just use what's already been developed by professionals and by people who have literally spent their entire lives studying this. They are going to be able to help way more than you. Your job is to just provide the information, and you don't have to be the source of it all. And also being willing to admit that, like, hey, I don't know everything. As your parent, that your kids are able to see that you're trying your best and that you clearly care about them enough to create a space where they can talk about this, and you're able to show them that in your actions and in the books you have around the house and in how you react to these types of conversations. So it can be really, there's a lot of different methods. You can be printable worksheets and workbooks or just picture books and all sorts of things, but you do want to make sure that they understand how sex works, and also, again, with the safety conversation, making sure that they understand how sometimes people can take advantage of sex and our genitals and parts of ourselves that are for us, and how we can navigate that and what to do if that has happened, or what to do if it happens, who to talk to, how to have that conversation. That also needs to be a part of the learning, because we want to make sure that they are happy and healthy and protected. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully this was helpful. I hope all my things that I produce are helpful. But again, it can kind of just dip your toe in, give you a little bit of a start, and you can continue that on sexedrescue.com and all of the other many places where resources are available. I will see you next week. Thanks for joining me.